This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever, and it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards. Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And we are delighted today to have with us Austin Williams, who's the director of the Future Cities Project. Austin is a senior lecturer at the Kingston School of Art and an honorary research fellow in architecture at a university in Suzhou in China. He's been an architect, a film producer, a journalist, and is China correspondent for the Architectural Review. He's founder of the mantownhuman and the author of China's Urban Revolution. Welcome, Austin.
Thank you both very much indeed. A pleasure to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you here, and we want to focus today on China's urban development.
Sure.
So, I guess really to start off, I mean, when we look at the emerging great cities of the 21st century, it would seem that several of them are going to be in China. How would you describe Chinese urbanism as opposed to, the urbanist pattern we see in the West?
Well, messy, ill thought out, hastily conceived, but I suppose you could draw the same comparison with cities in America or in the West 100 years ago. So, they're learning the same lessons, possibly learning them faster and better than we ever did. But, there's also the fact that the center, the idea of the city center or the heart of the city, all those conceptions that we always talk about in Western urban seminars seem to be slightly absent in China, partly because obviously the social organization of China is such that civil society doesn't really exist in the same way and form that we might imagine it to in the West. There is no kind of independent negotiated space. It's all pretty well controlled and managed. But cities have made incredible. The speed of development has been so remarkable. The urbanization process from when I went to China in 2010, and I was there for 6.5 years. The rapidity of development was kind of startling. The first ever high-speed rail train network had been built in 2010, and now they've got the biggest high-speed rail network of all the countries in the world put together. You think there's something miraculous and something terrifying, beautiful and ugly about that. And I think that's the thing we have to kind of recognize, that there's mistakes have been made along the way. So we can kind of go into, if you want to, kind of the use of Russian planning policy in its early formulations within China and the mess that made of things and the technocratic approach that they have to urban scale. But, you got to, as Mao said, I think, you have to break some eggs sometimes to make an omelette. So the fact that they've made those mistakes, they're learning from them and rapidly kind of developing. I think there's some fantastic potential for a lot of cities, and some of those cities may crumble and fold. But
Austin, the huge migration from countryside into urban areas in China over the past 3 decades must have brought with it social pressures and lifestyle changes that were hard for ordinary Chinese people to adapt to as they're coming in. What are the biggest pressures that you see in modern Chinese society in the cities?
Well, it's difficult to analyze it in just in the way that we might have those kind of romantic notions about, urban memories or memories lost in the process of urbanization, because the mindset, if you see urbanization as positive, or if you see development and progress and all those kind of words that we've lost sight of maybe in the West, if you see those things as positive, then maybe you can accept a bit of the challenges that come with it. So, when you say about urban migration from the rural areas, that's very true. There's like, in the first 10 years of this century, the equivalent of the entire population of America moved into cities. And in the next 10 years, the same number will also move into cities. But then you look at Shenzhen. Shenzhen was a place which didn't exist, 300,000 people living in fishing villages, and then a city of 15 million people built around them. They didn't have to move.
So I've been before and after.
Absolutely. So that idea of, there are places within Shenzhen, Baishizhou, and those little places which are effectively still villages, which are struggling to maintain a certain village identity, but they still recognize that the development, the progress, the escape from poverty, the full bellies that will come from maybe engaging in the city and its progress and dynamic is better than staying in their hovels. So they still have that mentality. That said, I think there is a moment happening in some of the other cities, maybe Beijing, where there is a recognition that the speed and development now really has to change. So because it's been done so fast, urban scale is monstrous. There's incredibly ugly streets. It's traffic congested and polluted and everything, and people are beginning to move out. That development of the middle class, as we would call it in the West, has led to a certain kind of anxiety in a sense that there could be a better development. So now China is thinking about urban parks in the same way that maybe, Olmsted, Daniel Burnham did, maybe 100 years ago. So that is now starting to encroach a little bit more on the urban mentality within China, which they didn't have time for, 20 years ago. It was about build a new country, build a new economy. So now they've reached that kind of that stage in the curve where they can think about humanity.
But you mentioned the lack of civic culture, which is, scary. Even if you make changes, are those changes going to be what people really want, or are they really changes that are more serve the economic and political interests at the top?
Well, everything is done to serve the party, Joe.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's not even about China. It's the party. So it's the defense of the party. So whenever you hear about people designing harmonious cities, harmony means social quietude or whatever it might be, just so you don't have any upset. I mean, it's the famous example of I think you mentioned in your book, actually, Joel, the Marxist party or the Marxist society in Beijing, who was closed down because they were starting to mobilize independently and start to think critically. You can't have that. So the Chinese state always kind of lets things out, starts to develop, maybe is a bit freer, starts to allow free thinking and a little bit of critical engagement with ideas. And then if it goes just that bit too far, you can rein it back in again. So so the maintenance of the party and the maintenance of these social harmony of the state is fundamental. How far they can go while still maintaining that without breaking it is the $64 million question.
Is what's happening in Hong Kong illustrative of what could be happening elsewhere?
Yeah, but it makes you wonder what's happening in Hong Kong. If you think Hong Kong is a dynamic hotbed of protest, or you think it's an incredibly efficient clampdown, I'd probably go with the latter. They're getting away with it. It's remarkable that they've done that to a pretty fundamental democracy. So it's a warning to Chinese people, and also when there's been surveys done within Guangzhou, within Shenzhen, and that kind of area about Hong Kong, whereas 5 years ago, the ambition was always to travel to Hong Kong to see a little bit of what life in the West could bring. Now people are much more afraid of Hong Kong, much more worried, much more happy to see the clampdown because it's destabilizing what's going on in Shenzhen. So it's a fascinating country for social stability and how they manage it without complete unrest. Partly because there's no structure to have unrest.
Well, and speaking of how they manage it, the whole hukou system is really critical for being able to move people to wherever the planners want them to be. Is that, are we seeing any strains in that? Is that, especially as we build these larger inland urban areas, that people may not have kind of like a immediate desire to go to, how important is the hukou system to be able to make the whole thing work?
Well, a hukou is always, taken under advisement. It's always kind of having some of the rough edges knocked off it, so it's a little bit unrecognizable to what it was 50 years ago. But it's an absolute disgrace for freedom of movement. There is no freedom of movement, even though you go to China and you can get on any train you want to, but you can't settle. I mean, if I might say for some of your listeners, just in case they don't know what a hukou system is, it's effectively, it's an internal passport, effectively. Right. So if you're born in the countryside, or if your parents are born in the countryside, you get given this status which says you're a rural dweller. And from the good old days, that meant that you had kind of ownership, inverted commas, to the land, that whatever you grew was yours. So you were a rural citizen. If you were born in the city, you had a certificate which said that you're a city dweller, which meant you didn't own the land at all, but you had access to services and healthcare and free education, which the rural dwellers didn't have. And there was always that kind of disparity. So if a rural dweller wants to come to the city, that's fair enough in some ways now. It wasn't 25 years ago, but now you can. But if you want to have access to a decent school, sorry, you don't have that right. You have to either go back to where you came from, or you get a kind of a migrant school, kind of quite a low quality. But what's interesting in some ways is the fact that sometimes those hukous can be given and taken away at random. So sometimes when you see these classifications of urban development and new cities or new towns being developed, sometimes that's simply because they've taken the rural hukou of people living in an area and given them an urban hukou, which makes them urban dwellers, which makes that area suddenly urban. So you can have cities and towns created just by exchange of paperwork rather than actually building anything. So, it's all game playing in China. You know what I mean? A lot of it's for the Western perception as much as kind of internal. But yeah, there's lots of funny little things like that going on in China all the time.
But are we seeing an emergence of a, if you will, not to use the old phrase, new urbanism, but a different kind of urbanism, particularly, I read a lot of Chinese science fiction, and, their vision of this future is so, completely controlled. And the other words, in the West, it strikes me that our cities, San Francisco, LA, London, Paris, are increasingly chaotic and somewhat dangerous in parts. Is China using, Marshall's does a lot of work in artificial intelligence. Is this something that we have to be watching? Is this how our cities may end up being monitored? And how successful has it been so far?
Oh, it's remarkable in China. I mean, I was driving with a friend in Suzhou in Jiangsu province, and this must have been maybe 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago. He was driving, I was in the passenger seat. He kind of ran a red light, or he went over the speed limit. I can't remember what it was. He went through it. There was a ping on his phone, and he'd just been charged $75 taken directly from his bank account. That facial recognition straight away through the system. And you think, how wonderful and how terrible, you know what I mean? And that kind of sums up the contradictions of China. So yes, I mean, there's monitoring gone crazy if you put a foot wrong. I mean, the whole coronavirus pandemic has actually legitimated in many Western eyes that idea about what the use and benefits of state monitoring. So, it will be coming to a town near you, I'm fairly sure. But that facial recognition, or actually having your medical records on your phone, which show green. If you want to get into a shop or a bank or get on a train, you have to show your mobile phone. And if it shows the wrong color, you ain't allowed on. If you've done petty misdemeanors, you can be disallowed from traveling on a train for up to 6 months, whatever. So it's an incredibly authoritarian system. The fact that we're in a coronavirus pandemic where authoritarianism seems to be the order of the day, it seems to be a little bit more acceptable. But hopefully civil liberties will out and people will recognize the nefariousness of it all.
I've been following a lot of the news from China about what appears to be kind of a clamping down on wealthy outliers like the Jack Ma's of the world, who were originally kind of the exemplars of Chinese success, but now may be a nail that sticks up that needs to be pounded down. What do you make of that? Is this part of what you were talking about earlier of the kind of reeling in trend going on in China, or is there something else going on?
Well, there's always lots going on under the surface that maybe we'll never know. But I mean, Jack Ma just said too much about what he really thought about the lack of dynamism within the economy and the lack of real entrepreneurship and all the rest of it. And, he basically upset the people at the top. So he's been called in for a bit of re-education. We might see him minus a few fingernails in a couple of months' time. And, he'll apologize. It's that kind of old Maoist idea of public apology as well, which is quite remarkable. And again, actually coming to a university near you too. Yes,
I think it's already there.
yeah, exactly. But that idea that you have to stand up and say, "I'm really sorry for having the audacity to have independent thought and critical opinions, and I won't do it again," brings you back into the fold. But it was only in 2000. I mean, it is quite interesting that it's the Communist Party of China. Yes, I mean, regardless of whether they are or not communist. They only allowed businessmen in 2000, 20 years ago, because obviously they were the bourgeois, Western apologists for capitalism. But because they were becoming, the society was growing and they needed them, then they brought them into the fold. But not everybody is, not every business leader is actually in the Communist Party. Some people don't want to be. So yeah, the state will kind of clamp down on outliers, but also it will obviously needs to allow them to flex their muscles a little bit. But you can't become too powerful. Since I mentioned Suzhou and Jiangsu province, Suzhou was a very early city development with Hangzhou, and it became a very powerful historic kind of city. And it's retained that level of wealth. It's a very, very wealthy city with Fortune 500 companies now investing there and everything. And obviously, Beijing and Shanghai, which again have their own tensions, but Shanghai will not allow Suzhou to develop so much material and economic power, which will then reflect in political authority to rival and challenge Shanghai. So it is disinvesting. So you can often see a lot of, there's no airport for Suzhou, for example. So they will not allow certain things to develop in order to keep you back in your box. Yes, know your place. So there's incredible tensions, and obviously Suzhou, as this example, just to take it to extremes, are getting frustrated and pissed off, if I might use the vernacular. So there's a protest and a pressure pushing back against it, and appeals being made to Beijing, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of stuff happening under the surface, which will never be revealed because that's party politics. But there is a genuine tension about people who've never been allowed to fly free like they would have maybe in the West. So yeah, it's an intriguing dilemma.
Those decisions about the airport is a wonderful story, by the way. I appreciate that. I didn't know that. The decision to not put an airport there, a Beijing-driven decision, a Shanghai-driven decision. Who actually says no? You can't do an airport.
Well, I mean, there's local. First of all, it's the party, yes. So within the party, there are various kind of organizations like planning authorities and development and all the rest of it. So there's a ministry for development. So they will obviously be making proposals, and they will be scheduling how they best develop their urban development. But so it's kind of it's a hidden thing. I mean, I've been to a couple of Communist Party planning meetings within Shanghai, where the majority of the time is taken with fantastically intelligent party apparatchiks who have got 25 degrees from Yale and Berkeley and goodness knows where, who come back and say we really still need to learn from Western urban development models. They still haven't yet developed the confidence to be able to assert something on a Chinese scale. So everything has to be kind of legitimated through evidence-based somewhere else. But in terms of Suzhou, the example of Suzhou, which is a historic, UNESCO heritage city, but then they built SIP, Suzhou Industrial Park, or Suzhou Singapore Industrial Park, as it was funded by Singapore, which is now the equivalent. So it's gone from a 3 million person city to a 7-8 million person city. The story goes, which I think is true, is that actually Singapore were coming into China to look at where they could invest, what cities they could invest in. And they went to Nanjing and they went all around that area. And Suzhou was being overlooked in that way I was just describing, that they weren't really allowed to look at Suzhou. But on the way back, as the Singaporeans wanted to invest in the East Bank of Shanghai. But Shanghai sensibly thought, we'll keep hold of that one, yes. But anyway, as the Singaporeans were leaving, apparently the mayor of Suzhou sent out like an emissary to waylay them, like a highwayman, stopping them on the road and saying, actually, we've got all this agricultural land in this fantastic area slot. We could do wonders with it, just get rid of all the agricultural people and we could build a new city for you. And the Singaporeans were sold on it. So there was this kind of underhand politicking that went on, and the rest is history. I don't know what happened to the mayor, mind, he got moved. So I haven't followed
very
his
interesting.
demise.
It's kind of half central planning and half chamber of commerce,
yeah, and half, just negotiating and trying to work out deals on the side.
Deal, right?
But when on the one hand, it would seem to me that we have much to learn from China, but on the other hand, when I've been there, I've been astounded how incredibly inhuman the scale is. You walk around the parts of Beijing where it's one high-rise building after another. There's nobody on the street. And then what's interesting is when you go to the old concessions, like in Tianjin, you go to the French concession, and all of a sudden it's lively. It's 2-3-story buildings, diverse architecture. Is there any kind of rebellion against the kind of city that's being developed? It's like China strikes me as like increasingly like Hudson Yards on steroids.
Yes, I mean there's a lot of protest, and it's a bit like the Communist Party up until the mid 2000s were made up of engineers. They were all the kind of the party officials were engineers because it was an engineering project. You had to build a new country. Now most of the Politburo are made up of kind of social scientists, God help us. But because they're doing a little bit more kind of soft science, soft sell. So there is that kind of shift which has happened, since 1999, whatever. In the new millennium, there's been a movement to recognize that there's still a requirement to build and build fast and house people and develop the economy, while at the same time recognizing that there's a little bit of inhumanity happening there. So when you look down in Shenzhen is a really good example because it's near to Hong Kong, because it's near to kind of the Asian dynamic economies. There's been a bit of an incorporation of some of that architecture. So you have different roof heights. You have a little bit of topography built into the buildings themselves, and the streets are wider and narrower and all the rest of it. You go to the north of China and it's that kind of plot line, south facing. That's what you're going to get. So there's a little bit of experimentation which is allowed in Shenzhen. I mean, remember, Shenzhen is where Deng Xiaoping went in 1992 to talk about the opening up of the country because it was so far away from Beijing that he thought he could get rid of the bureaucrats having a go at him by coming right to the very south and opening up the economy. So there's experiments happening all over the country, and there's a certain concern amongst the central party state that they might be losing control of some of these areas and the influence that they're getting through their own dynamic. But I think that the sense of architectural schools and the number of architectural graduates now coming out of schools and urbanism is becoming very popular. Like 10 years ago when I went to China, there were not that many architecture schools, but they were all called engineering schools because you went in there, you never chose to go to study architecture because your parents told you what you were going to study. But the idea that you were going to be an architect, but it was an engineering project. Now they've started to allow a little bit more, you can now study literature or art or theater in China. That was unheard of 10 years ago, right? So that opening up of creativity, which, as we said earlier, has its own problems of creative thinking, is beginning to have an influence. So more people are now, especially having studied in America or the West and gone back to China and seen the possibilities of small scale urban interventions, are beginning to look more locally at building pocket parks, all those kind of William H. White stuff from 50 years ago is now coming into China. And on top of that, the Chinese state has recognized what Marshall was saying, which is that so many people have migrated from the countryside, which is kind of congesting the cities, that they are, in typical Chinese fashion, they're forcibly pushing them back into the countryside, while at the same time talking about countryside redevelopment. So there's a lot more architects now who are building in the country, building, really nice architecture, but on rural scale. Whether that's a defeat for the idea of, building a better world, or whether that's, nice, nuanced kind of architecture is for you to decide.
Or whether or not we have to look forward to China 2.0 20 years from now. That's a softer, more humanitarian-driven face to it.
But let me just, one last thing I wanted to get into, which is what I've noticed in East Asia in general, and a lot of work I've done in Singapore, and even more so in China. When you talk to young people, they don't want to have kids. The environment that's being developed, and this is something that I think no one has figured out yet, which is if you force people into small spaces, and if you force them to live in this, very hyper-competitive, high-density environment, they're not going to have children. Has anyone thought about that? I mean, because long-term, it would seem to me China's biggest crisis is demographic.
Yeah, I mean, they've thought about, obviously they got rid of the one-child policy for that very reason, to encourage people to have kids. But of course, because, it's inculcated that you shouldn't, that it was a criminal thing to do, plus people were beginning to get worried about the economy and their jobs in the recession in 2008. Very few people took up on it. I mean, ironically, they've also had a counter position with the Uyghurs, where the Uyghurs were allowed to have many children until the 2000s, in which they've been stopped and forced to have one. So there's this kind of weird thing going on within the races within China. But yeah, it's also part of that, progressive, if you excuse the phrase, development of society, like in the West, where, maybe in the past, in the feudal era, you would have had a big family because that's the way it worked, and you safeguarded each other and you look after each other and all the rest of it. And then as society developed and you could have more autonomy, that you then didn't rely on all those old familial ways of looking after your grandmother in the back bedroom, that you thought, actually, I'll buy her a flat and I'll go and live on my own, thank you very much, and have a party. So there's a lot of that coming up where it's really challenging some of the old Confucian tropes and the old social organizations in society. And again, that's also very dangerous for China as a structure. They're very worried about that kind of social fragmentation. They want to encourage family harmony. One of the things the Chinese state did about 10 years ago to encourage family harmony was to give the authority to grandmothers that they could prosecute their sons and daughters, or grandsons and daughters, if they didn't come back for the tomb cleaning day, which is their family get-together. So if you didn't come back for that, they'd prosecute you, and they thought that would be a way of building family harmony rather than increasing resentment. But if you have a technocratic society, sometimes they just kind of come up with these technical solutions which undermine the very thing they're trying to create.
Well, the good news is now if you get prosecuted for that, they can instantly identify who you are and find you.
And they can cut off your credit and
exactly.
Right, you're out of Alipay.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Austin Williams, thank you so much for sharing a half hour with us. This is really fascinating, and we're looking forward to getting further comment from you as China progresses, and just have you take the temperature for us to say here's where they are.
That's very kind of you. But in coronavirus pandemic, it's always nice to talk to anybody.
Yeah, exactly. And good luck getting the vaccine into the UK and solving these problems. And we hope you stay healthy.
That's very kind of you. Same to you both. Same to you both. Lovely talking to you.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Austin.